Appropriate and proper behavior in front of a jury is an extremely important factor, although at times it can be difficult, as stress and emotional strain can significantly complicate the situation. However, as numerous examples and established court practice show, the best thing one can do in such a situation is to summon all their willpower and pull themselves together. Bill Mowbray was a resident of Brownsville, Texas, USA. At the time of the events described, in 1987, he was an exemplary family man, married to his wife Suzy. For each of the spouses, it was already their second marriage. From his first marriage, Bill had a daughter, Christine, who lived with her mother. When Bill met Suzy, she was also divorced and had 2 children, who from then on began to live with them. For 9 years, the couple tirelessly built their family happiness. They had a lot in common, including an age difference of only 4 years. Suzy had always been somewhat eccentric, but Bill considered her the epitome of a mother and wife. However, Bill was focused not only on his family and children but also on his career. After graduating from college, he began working in the field of car sales. Over the years of hard work, Bill managed to become a fairly well-known businessman. As of 1987, he had been running a successful Cadillac dealership called Bill Mowbray Motors in their city for 13 years. In this business, Bill enlisted the full support of his wife. She often visited him at work and starred in commercials that aired around the city. This allowed the family to earn a good income, so the Mowbrays were considered well-off and were local celebrities, often featured on television. They loved to travel, and in addition to a huge mansion in Brownsville, they managed to purchase 2 villas on the coast and several cars. Unfortunately, not everything was as cloudless as it might have seemed from the outside. In recent years, Bill's business had not been doing well. His dealership stopped developing, and over the course of a few years, Mowbray found himself mired in debt, as expenses began to exceed income. Up until the end, the couple managed to maintain the illusion of a prosperous life, continuing to spend considerable funds, but over time it became evident that they were facing a serious financial crisis. The worst part was that this crisis affected not only the Mowbrays' purchasing power. Even before 1987, the difficult situation began to have a detrimental effect on Bill's mental health. He developed a depressive state and repeatedly said that the only way out of this situation was to voluntarily end his life. For Suzy, this was a real shock, because her husband had never expressed such intentions before, let alone made attempts to take his own life. She was seriously concerned that Bill might do something foolish. Close relatives were also alarmed by such thoughts. Mowbray was even taken to see a psychotherapist, hoping it would help, but it did not have a significant effect. Bill himself repeatedly stated that they needed money, otherwise the family business would go under and they would find themselves on the brink of poverty. There was no way out of the financial crisis, and the man found himself in a hopeless situation facing the threat of bankruptcy. It seemed that only a new loan from the bank could remedy the situation. On September 15, 1987, 39-year-old Suzy and 43-year-old Bill called her son to wish him a happy 16th birthday. At that time, Suzy and her daughter were visiting her father. The conversation was pleasant, and nothing indicated trouble. Late in the evening, the couple watched a TV show and went to bed. However, around 2:15 a.m., the woman woke up and saw her husband lying on his side, aiming a gun at his head, holding it in his right hand. Suzy did not have time to react before a shot rang out. She called out to her husband in fright, but he did not respond, and blood quickly soaked the bedding. Coming to her senses, Suzy realized with horror that Bill was seriously injured. She immediately jumped out of bed and rushed to the home phone. But instead of dialing the emergency services number, for some reason the woman called Luke Froh, Bill's partner at work. She told him that her husband had shot himself and she didn't know what to do. Luke, of course, advised her to call 911 immediately, and Suzy did just that. However, precious minutes had already been lost. When the paramedics arrived at the call, they found the woman on the porch of the house. She was standing on the terrace with a cigarette in one hand and a glass of a drink in the other. Surprisingly, Suzy was not crying but behaving quite calmly. She led the medics into the house and pointed to the bedroom, but she didn't even go inside herself. Bill Mowbray was lying in bed, still alive but in critical condition. He was urgently hospitalized, but the man died in the hospital. The cause of death was obviously a gunshot wound to the head, and the gun itself was lying next to the body in a pool of blood. Initially, the main version of the investigation was Bill's voluntary departure from life, but law enforcement officers sought to thoroughly verify everything in order to close the case with confidence. Forensic experts began to examine the crime scene, where they had to deal with an excessive amount of blood. To establish an accurate picture of the events, a much more detailed examination was needed. Blood spatters were noticed almost everywhere, on most of the furniture, on the wall next to Bill's body, and even on the ceiling fan. Fortunately, the team of specialists included an expert in blood spatter analysis, who immediately set to work. According to his conclusion, the cause of Bill's death was a single shot to the head, with no signs of struggle or resistance. No fingerprints other than his own were found on the gun lying next to the businessman's body. From the very beginning of the investigation, Suzy consistently defended her version of events, insisting that Bill had long suffered from a depressive disorder, had suicidal tendencies, and had repeatedly talked about it. Her words were confirmed by most of the couple's close relatives and friends. According to their testimonies, the businessman had barely been keeping his head above water lately, running the dealership, which noticeably worsened his psychological state. However, Suzy's own behavior aroused considerable suspicion. She didn't look like a grief-stricken widow at all, talking about her husband's death as if it were some mundane thing. But even that didn't make the investigators look at her more closely. The most suspicious thing seemed to be the 12-hour time frame immediately after Bill's death. During this period, the dead man's brother Jim came to the Mowbray's house, wanting to talk to Suzy, support her, and see the scene of the incident with his own eyes to find out what had really happened. It's hard to imagine his surprise when he went upstairs and suddenly heard music and women's laughter coming from there. Soon the heroine of this story came out to Jim and casually informed him that she was having a party with her friends. Of course, Jim found such behavior extremely outrageous. Subsequently, he became one of Suzy's most ardent opponents, who tried with all her might to prove her innocence in her husband's death. It turned out that the women had managed to remove all the furniture and carpeting from the bedroom that was splattered with Bill's blood. The group of friends was not only having fun to music but also started repainting the bedroom walls a different color. Naturally, the police perceived such behavior as a blatant and brazen attempt to destroy evidence of the crime. Despite these seemingly desperate measures by Suzy to cover her tracks, experts were still able to reconstruct a complete picture of the event based on an analysis of the shape of the blood spatters. Now the version of Bill's suicide faded into the background, and the detectives became convinced that the fatal shot was fired by Suzy herself. Apart from the evidence collected on the first day, the investigators had no other leads, so they focused on the remains of the furniture and the nightgown worn by the victim's wife. After carefully analyzing these pieces of evidence, the experts came to the conclusion that Bill had become a victim of his own wife. Most likely, she had shot him in the head while the man was sleeping carelessly. The accusation came as a shock to Suzy, and she immediately hired a lawyer to defend her. The woman consistently defended the version of financial difficulties in the family, which supposedly drove her husband to suicide, and this line of defense found numerous confirmations during the investigation. Suzy claimed that the couple's unsuccessful trip to the bank for a loan was the last straw for Bill, and that was what pushed him to take the fatal step. The businessman's inner circle was aware of his difficult financial situation, but not everyone was inclined to consider his widow innocent. Detectives spoke with the bank employee Bill had approached shortly before his death. He said that during their meeting, the businessman was in an extremely depressed state, broke down in tears, and stated that he would take his own life if he did not get approval for a new loan. Unfortunately, Bill's financial affairs turned out to be so bad that his application for $200,000 had to be rejected. The credit expert was powerless to help and was forced to refuse. There were many witnesses to the desperate state and deep depression Mowbray was in during the last days of his life. Despite this, certain doubts about the role of his wife remained, and some interpreted her strange behavior as a kind of celebration on the occasion of her husband's death. Such rumors not only intensified the suspicions of the investigation but also caused condemnation from the general public. However, Suzy's lawyer continued to insist on her innocence. He claimed that when Bill last visited the bank, his goal was to get a loan to save his business and pay off debts that were already threatening him with bankruptcy at the time. Therefore, the refusal was a real blow to him. On that fateful evening, Bill returned home gloomy and aloof, hardly talking to anyone. Suzy barely managed to calm him down, but it didn't make things any easier. The man spent the last days of his life in a state of deep depression, desperately seeking a way out of a difficult financial situation, but it was all in vain. According to Suzy, it was after the bank's refusal that Bill began to talk more and more often about wanting to end his life. She tried to support him and even accompanied him to a psychotherapist, but it did not yield the desired result. At the same time, the lawyer was looking for any facts that could confirm the innocence of his client. And there were some successes. Among Bill's old friends, people were found who reported that 10 years before the tragedy, the man had already tried to take his own life. This happened back in the 1970s, before his marriage to Suzy, so no one told his wife about this incident. It seemed that after meeting Suzy, Bill's life had finally gotten back on track, and his loved ones calmed down, no longer worrying about him. However, this information only confirmed the fact that the main figure in the case had long had suicidal tendencies. Suzy's defender was convinced that this would become a weighty argument in favor of his client if the case went to trial. The lawyer also did not consider the party thrown by the woman in the house immediately after the tragedy as evidence of her involvement in her husband's murder. Moreover, he argued that all the evidence provided by the prosecution was indirect and would be easy to refute. In his opinion, the widow's strange behavior did not at all indicate that it was she who pulled the trigger. However, the victim's relatives, in particular his brother Jim, insisted that by her compromising actions, Suzy demonstrated complete indifference to Bill and demanded that his killer be held accountable. And the investigation's version that the businessman's death was not an accident had some grounds. In particular, the detectives were puzzled by the fact that Bill allegedly decided to end his life in the presence of his wife, who was sleeping carelessly beside him. Such behavior is not entirely typical of potential suicides, who usually prefer to die alone. Moreover, to carry out his intention, Mowbray would have had to act in one of two ways. The first is to keep a loaded gun by the bed or under the pillow, which, however, is not such a rare occurrence. The second is to wake up in the middle of the night, get up, take the weapon, and then return to bed to shoot himself. Suzy did not remember her husband getting up that fateful night, although she may simply not have noticed it through her sleep. Instead, the woman recalled that she had once held Bill's gun when she found it hidden under his pillow. The widow claimed that he always kept the weapon in the bedroom solely for self-defense. In fact, for Texas residents, this was considered a completely normal practice. However, the detectives naturally had a question as to why, then, no fingerprints of Suzy were found on the gun if, by her own admission, she had touched it. In response, the woman insisted that Bill regularly cleaned and lubricated the weapon, so he could have simply wiped it with a rag. But the investigators refused to believe this version. They carefully studied the Mowbrays' marital relationship and found out that over the years of his second marriage, Bill had repeatedly cheated on his wife, which she was well aware of. Once, when Suzy's patience ran out, she even moved out with her children and settled in a hotel. But later, Bill persuaded her to return, and the family was reunited. However, there were rumors that marital relations never improved after this incident. Allegedly, the Mowbrays were planning a divorce and had even begun to divide their jointly acquired property. All this gave Suzy a strong motive to get rid of her annoying husband. But what caused the most suspicion in the investigation was the woman's behavior immediately after the shot when she woke up. After all, Suzy was well aware that Bill, although seriously wounded, was still alive. So why, instead of calling an ambulance and giving her husband a chance to be saved, did she decide to call his colleague? The heroine of this tangled story explained her strange act by the fact that she was confused and had a poor understanding of how to act in such a critical situation. So she just wanted to consult with an old friend of their family. By the way, at some stage of the investigation, there was even a suspicion that this Luke could have been an accomplice in the murder, but it was not confirmed. According to the man, when Suzy called him, there was not a hint of fear or despair in her voice. However, Luke turned out to be quite sensible and persistently advised the woman to immediately dial 911, the emergency services number. Which, after a short hesitation, she did. Examining the body and the scene, forensic experts noticed another extremely suspicious detail. It turned out that in addition to the fatal head wound, the deceased also had a gunshot wound to his left arm. At the same time, it was obvious that Bill had been shot with a gun clenched in his right hand. But here's the odd thing, no drop of blood was found on his right palm and fingers. Experienced experts knew well that during a shot at point-blank range, a whole bloody vortex of numerous tiny spatters inevitably forms. A few microscopic stains were found on Suzy's nightgown. So, logically, traces of blood should have remained on the shooter's hand as well. But Bill's right hand was found carefully hidden under a pillow, as if someone had deliberately made sure it was clean. Therefore, the likelihood that the man had actually committed suicide seemed minimal to the investigation. However, it was impossible to prove Suzy's guilt without a strong motive. As the detectives found out, the suspect did have one, of a purely mercenary nature. However, it was not about a banal desire to receive insurance after Bill's death, as the lives of both spouses were insured. But shortly before her husband's death, Suzy suddenly became interested for the first time in the details of his insurance policy, calling the company. And she found out that Bill had made several significant changes to the document beforehand. Firstly, he increased the amount of compensation to be paid to the beneficiary in the event of his death to almost $2 million. And secondly, he excluded his wife from the list of beneficiaries, designating his daughter from his first marriage, Christine, as the sole recipient of the money. Moreover, all these changes were to take effect literally a few days after Bill's death. Upon learning this, Suzy became enraged, and the investigation regarded her state as another motive to get rid of her hated husband with his financial problems as soon as possible in order to grab the money and pay off all debts. It is quite probable that Bill decided to exclude his wife from the list of beneficiaries because he no longer trusted her and had doubts about her fidelity. Instead, he sought to ensure a carefree future for his own daughter. But despite the logic of this version, several contradictory points immediately arose in the case. First, if Bill had really planned to end his life, he would almost certainly have waited until the changes to the insurance policy officially took effect. And for that, he would have had to be patient for just a few days. Moreover, the man was well versed in legal and financial nuances, so he should have known about the peculiarities of Texas legislation regarding suicide. Its essence was that insurance companies do not make any payments to beneficiaries if the insured person voluntarily ended their life earlier than 2 years after the policy was issued. That is, all of Bill's potential plans to secure his daughter's future in this way were doomed to fail from the start. Therefore, the detectives were inclined to think that the businessman did not actually intend to commit suicide. With his talk about suicide, he most likely just tried to play on the pity of others and manipulate them, in particular the bank employees, hoping to get the coveted loan. And in general, weighing all the illogicalities and oddities in this case, the investigators concluded that Bill was not going to take his own life and that he was helped to do so. Ultimately, based on a body of circumstantial evidence, Suzy was arrested and charged with the murder of her own husband. During the trial, the prosecution actively used one of the common methods of forensic science, the analysis of bloodstain patterns. This approach was first used to obtain evidence and substantiate charges back in the 1950s. Herbert McDonald is considered the founder of the method. It was he who was involved in the trial of Suzy Mowbray as an expert, and his testimony played an important role. Interestingly, this principle of analysis, which for a long time was considered basic and indisputable and firmly rooted in the American justice system, was seriously criticized and questioned by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in 2009. The reason for this was the fact that the correct and accurate application of the methodology required considerable experience and qualification of the expert, which was often lacking. By the way, it is known that much of the evidence in the Bill Mowbray murder case was analyzed by inexperienced professionals. However, this circumstance was not taken into account in the trial. Although the analysis of the shape of blood spatters has since been criticized, it still retains its value and is still actively used. However, now they try to involve only highly qualified forensic experts with solid experience in such examinations. In addition, at one time, doubts about the reliability of this method led to a review of a number of court verdicts. But at the time of the Suzy Mowbray case, Herbert MacDonald's approach was considered indisputable. Interestingly, the defendant's former father-in-law unexpectedly took her side. The man stated that even after the divorce, he maintained a warm relationship with his former daughter-in-law and never noticed any signs of aggression in her. Moreover, according to him, Suzy did not know how to handle weapons at all. Suzy was also supported by Luke Froh, a family friend and partner of the deceased Bill, whom the woman called immediately after the shot. He stated that he believed in the version of Mowbray's voluntary departure from life. According to Luke, because of problems with the car dealership, he himself was planning to quit, and Bill took this news very hard. In general, the businessman was in an extremely depressed state during the last days of his life and gave the impression of a very lonely person. But the prosecution did not give up and continued to insist on their version of events, using all possible means of influencing the jury. For greater persuasiveness, the prosecution even demonstrated the Mowbray couple's bed in the courtroom, on which they placed two mannequins in the form of Bill and Suzy. The victim's blood stains were still visible on the sheet. In this visual way, the prosecutor wanted to convey to the jury his vision of what had actually happened that fateful night. And although the defense made considerable efforts to convince the court of their client's innocence, the jury ultimately found Suzy Mowbray guilty of murdering her own husband. On June 9, 1988, the woman was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. However, despite the harsh sentence, the widow still had many supporters who sincerely believed in her innocence. Suzy was most supported by her biological son Wade and her daughter from her previous marriage. They made every effort to get the unfair, in their opinion, court decision overturned or reviewed. The children knew that until her last breath, their mother had supported Bill and could not have simply taken and shot him. While the woman was serving her sentence behind bars, Wade entered law school and devoted all his time to a thorough study of the materials of the criminal case. He meticulously analyzed all the evidence, looking for the slightest mistakes and procedural violations that investigators, prosecutors, and involved experts could have made. The young man desperately tried to find solid grounds for filing an appeal and worked closely with his mother's lawyers in this direction. Unfortunately, processing a huge array of information took a lot of time, because each fact had to be carefully verified and comprehended. But despite everything, Wade did not lose faith and was firmly convinced that he would be able to prove his mother's innocence and achieve justice. At that time, Suzy Mowbray had already spent 8 years behind bars. Finally, the defenders managed to prepare and file an appeal, which was drawn up so thoroughly that it did not seem possible to ignore it. The main emphasis in the document was placed on the analysis of blood spatters, which played a key role in the prosecution's tactics and became one of the decisive pieces of evidence against Suzy. But the defense voiced serious doubts about the proper qualifications of the forensic expert who conducted this examination. According to the specialist, more than 45 small drops of her husband's blood were found on the accused nightgown. Interestingly, it was in this key piece of evidence that the main weakness of the prosecution's position and a weighty reason for its refutation lay. Suzy's lawyers challenged the reliability of the results of the luminol test, pointing out that not only blood but also some other organic substances can cause fluorescence in ultraviolet light. In their opinion, the experts should have necessarily conducted an additional check specifically for the presence of blood, which was not done. But the worst thing was that at the time the appeal was filed, the nightgown itself had mysteriously disappeared from the evidence, and therefore lost any evidentiary value. After carefully analyzing the case materials, the court nevertheless accepted the appeal for consideration. before the start of the new trial in 1998, all the evidence, except for the missing garment, was subjected to scrupulous verification once again. Meanwhile, the defense also thoroughly finalized their tactics and strategy. At the retrial, the defense finally voiced a version that could explain even the absence of blood traces on the weapon and Bill's shot hand. The lawyer suggested that the man could have shot himself while holding the gun under the pillow, and his left hand at the moment of the shot was on the opposite side of his head, where the bullet left the exit hole. The behavior of some experts during the new hearing seemed rather strange. In particular, the forensic medical examiner who had performed the autopsy on Mowbray's body at the time made one of the key statements. In his opinion, the evidence gathered was insufficient to state with absolute certainty that Suzy had killed her husband. However, in order not to completely disgrace himself, he still continued to insist that the businessman could not have shot himself without outside help. And since only Bill and his wife were in the house at the time of the tragedy, the expert believed that she should be considered the main suspect. Ultimately, Wade Mowbray's studies at the law school and his active cooperation with his mother's lawyers bore fruit. Thanks to the tireless efforts of the defenders, a kind of conspiracy in the ranks of the prosecution was revealed, which essentially deprived Suzy of one of the fundamental constitutional rights, the right to a fair trial. It turns out that during the investigation, the prosecution involved the renowned expert Herbert McDonnell in the case, who was to re-examine the suspect's nightgown and confirm the prosecution's version. But contrary to expectations, the scientist confidently refuted the arguments of the accusers. However, at the trial, for some reason, the prosecutors decided to keep silent about McDonnell's conclusions and did not transfer his examination to the defense at all, although the law obliged them to do so. Instead, they continued to use the nightgown as evidence against Suzy, which, of course, was a gross violation of her rights. Therefore, it is difficult to overestimate the role of Wade Mowbray in the difficult struggle for his mother's freedom. After all, it was he who was able to discern this crucial detail, which testified to outright lies and gross manipulations on the part of the prosecution. Now the defense only had to convince the jury of this. The so-called Brady Rule in American jurisprudence directly obliges prosecutors to transfer to the defense any significant information that could exonerate the defendant or mitigate their guilt. However, in the case of Suzy Mowbray, this norm was grossly ignored. Herbert McDonnell's conclusion did not even reach the lawyers. Finally, in January 1998, Suzy found herself in the courtroom again, where a retrial was to take place. Over the years spent behind bars, the once attractive woman had turned into a pale shadow of herself. But despite her emaciated face, hope for long-awaited freedom still shone in her eyes. As before, Suzy insisted on her complete innocence. Her friends who took part in that dubious party with the hasty renovation of the bedroom where the owner of the house was killed sided with the accused. They claimed that it was actually just another one of Suzy's eccentric antics. According to them, the woman simply wanted to get rid of the horrific bloodstains as soon as possible and did not even suspect that she would later be accused of deliberately destroying evidence. Moreover, one of the friends explained her participation in that performance by the fact that when they arrived, the house was not cordoned off with police tape, and they themselves were not warned that the inspection of the scene was not yet complete. Indeed, initially the investigators simply concluded that a voluntary departure from life had occurred in the Mowbray house. So they did not pay too much attention to the situation at the scene of the tragedy, striving to close the case as soon as possible and send the materials to the archive. So Suzy was indeed allowed to stay in the unfenced house. Another friend claimed that she only wanted to help Suzy, who did not want her children to see the blood-spattered room when they returned home. That is why the tipsy women decided to refresh the interior on the spur of the moment. Moreover, both sincerely believed in the innocence of the mistress of the house. At the retrial, the unqualified expert who had examined Suzy's nightgown at the time also testified. He admitted that his previous testimony did not really have a scientific basis. Even Herbert McDonnell was stunned by how that examination was conducted. According to him, instead of a thorough analysis, the would-be specialist simply tried to estimate the shape and location of the spatters by eye. What can we say when none of the experts even bothered to check whether the stains found on the nightgown were blood? All this data was extremely insufficient to draw any reasonable conclusions. In light of the new facts, the version of Suzy Mowbray's lawyers began to seem quite convincing to the jury. The defense focused on Bill's suicidal tendencies, and this time their arguments were supported by much more substantial evidence than the uncertain testimony of a few of the deceased's friends. The decisive factor in the lawyers' tactics was the businessman's extremely difficult financial situation. When the bank refused him another loan, Bill's company was on the verge of complete bankruptcy. The family was rapidly falling into a debt hole, so at some point the man may have had the idea to shoot himself. After all, by becoming a victim of an accident, he would at least ensure a carefree life for his daughter from his first marriage at the expense of substantial insurance payments. That is why in the last days of his life, Bill spent the rest of his savings to maximize the amount of compensation in favor of Christine. According to the defenders, the fact that the suicide occurred a few days before the changes in the policy took effect was explained by Bill's extremely unstable emotional state. It is quite possible that at some stage, severe depression or a sudden deterioration in his well-being did not allow the man to soberly assess all the legal nuances. At least this was indicated by the businessman's strange behavior in the last days before his death. Ultimately, the lawyers managed to sow reasonable doubts in the minds of the jurors regarding Suzy Mowbray's guilt. The defense team was confident that they had managed to tip the scales in favor of the defendant, so they eagerly awaited the closing arguments. But suddenly, during the prosecutor's closing speech, a strange metamorphosis happened to the accused. The 49-year-old woman seemed to completely lose control of herself. She wildly screamed that she had not killed her own husband and burst into tears. This emotional turnaround was unexpected. On the one hand, the jurors could feel sympathy and believe in the sincerity of these words and tears. But on the other hand, it could be interpreted as a sign of uncontrolled aggression, which would only worsen the situation. The jury deliberation on the verdict lasted 4 hours in tense anticipation. And although no specific conclusions were made about Suzy's actual guilt or innocence, on January 23, 1998, she was acquitted on all charges. However, the widow still had opponents convinced of her guilt, who focused on her behavior. Undoubtedly, the woman behaved strangely, but supporters, including her son and daughter, explained this by the stress and emotional tension caused by the situation. Opponents, however, insisted that even her outburst of anger in court was carefully planned. It was believed that the woman tried to finally convince the jurors of the miscarriage of justice regarding Suzy's conviction. However, the lawyer denied that this emotional outburst was planned. The defender, on the contrary, considered this move too risky for such a situation. They undoubtedly had enough convincing arguments. Such a move could have provoked a negative reaction from the jury. As already mentioned at the retrial, Suzy's nightgown was not presented as evidence. The prosecution team stated that the evidence was lost. This raised even more questions, because usually such physical evidence does not disappear without a trace. The prosecution's strategy came under severe criticism. Therefore, the controversial evidence could have simply been destroyed to avoid a new examination. The opinion of the respected Herbert MacDonald could have played against the prosecution, so without this evidence they still had a chance to fight. In the year of her 50th birthday, after being imprisoned in the winter, Suzy Mowbray was acquitted, which became the best birthday present for her, for which she thanked her son. Later, in 2001, she gave an interview. At that time, the unjustly convicted woman had already been free for 3.5 years. In total, she spent just under 10 years behind bars. As Suzy noted, now she just wanted her children to be proud of their mother. But not everyone was satisfied with this result. The prosecution, Bill's first wife, and his daughter Christine considered the verdict unfair. They were sure that Suzy had escaped punishment for murder. According to the first wife, after Bill's death, Suzy began to urgently sell things from his house in order to get at least some money. A real court battle for the husband's inheritance unfolded between the first and second wives. No one ever received a single dollar from Bill's life insurance amount. Suzy planned to write a book about her adventures, but since 2002, nothing has been heard about these plans. During this period, she went to court demanding the return of the insurance payment for her deceased husband. It is known that she lost this process. Her son Wade continued his law career but later moved away from this activity. The young man became a pastor and began to advise other clergy. It is worth noting that Suzy, who previously loved being the center of attention and participated in her husband's advertising campaign in the 1980s, completely disappeared from the screens after the failure of the appeal regarding the payment of insurance funds. Suzy Mowbray did not attend the last TV show in 2021 dedicated to this case. However, her lawyer was present there. He openly called it a tragedy that the businessman's widow spent so much time behind bars, which ruined her life. He always considered her innocent. Please write your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. For those who are new here, subscribing is the best way to stay updated on future content. Also give a like please. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thank you for your support during this difficult time. Until next time, friends.